Senator Kennedy, face the nation. You're about to see the junior senator from Massachusetts, prominently mentioned as a leading Democratic presidential contender in 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy, face the nation with questions from veteran correspondents representing the nation's press. John Madigan, assistant managing editor of the Chicago American. Blair Clark of CBS News. James McConaughey, chief of the Washington Bureau of Time and Life. And William H. Lawrence, national correspondent for the New York Times. And now from CBS News, the moderator of Face the Nation, Stuart Noven.
When the presidential elections are talked about here in Washington, and that's most of the time, the name of Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts emerges as one of the White House possibles on the Democratic side. Senator Kennedy has this week been active as a member of the McClellan Committee going into the labor management relations, and he's here now to face the nation. Senator, you've been asking a lot of questions this week on the McClellan Committee and on your own subcommittee. We're going to give you a chance now to give us some answers, if you will, so let's get into it with this first question from Mr. Lawrence.
Senator, considering the power that organized labor has within the Democratic Party, do you feel that your advocacy of legislation on the control of welfare funds and so forth that the AFL and CIO find objectionable is a likely hindrance to your candidacy for president in 1960?
Well, that's two questions, Mr. Lawrence. I'm just a candidate for the United States Senate in Massachusetts now. I'm chairman of the permanent subcommittee on labor legislation as well as a member of the McClellan Committee, and I have a responsibility to both of those committees. It seems to me that the legislation which I've introduced, which only provides for a report by any union official who owns a substantial interest in a company at a time when he's representing the employees or when he's made a substantial loan from the union fund, those are the only times the report would take place. That does not seem to me unreasonable. I think it should be considered by the committee, and though I know that some members of the AFL-CIO dislike it, I think we should consider it and decide whether it would assist and whether it would carry out the recommendations of the McClellan Committee.
Senator, is your change in your thinking on foreign policy? A couple of years ago, you were generally supporting Mr. Benson. Now you're attacking his policies. Does this change indicate that you are making some kind of solicitation to political support in the Farm Belt?
Well, now, Mr. Lawrence asked me the opposite question, whether I was going to lose support of labor, so I think I'll give the same answer. It seemed to me that, in the first place, I did not support the program of Mr. Benson's. I did support a degree of flexibility. There were three assumptions. First, that food prices in the city would come down. Secondly, that we would have less surpluses stored. And third, that it would result in greater prosperity for the farmer. As none of those theses have been come true, it seemed to me, therefore, we should search for an alternative. And I have suggested that is a basic responsibility of the Democratic Party, not to confine themselves to criticizing present policies, but also suggesting alternatives.
Senator, as you pointed out, you are running only nominally for the Senate of the United States from Massachusetts this year. I wondered what your assessment was of your chances in November, particularly in view of reports that your probable running mate for governor, Governor Furcolo, is in some political difficulty in Massachusetts.
Well, I think the Democrats are going to be successful in Massachusetts. I think Governor Furcolo will be successful, and I am hopeful that I will win. I think the Democrats are going to win all across the nation. I think they will in Massachusetts, too.
Senator, George Meany the other day in testifying before your subcommittee threw up his hands and said, "Protect us from our friends." To whom was he referring, you?
He was referring to a group of prominent labor specialists headed by Professor Cox of the Harvard Law School, Professor Lester of Princeton, and others, who formed, and Sumner Schlichter of Harvard, who formed a committee this fall to work on improvements in legislation which would make impossible some of the abuses which were uncovered by the McClellan Committee. When I read off the names of these men, he said that many of them had been friendly to labor, and he therefore said, God preserve us from his friend. He may have been including me also, but I don't know.
This committee was formed at your request, was it not?
That's correct. That's right, to consider what could be done which would not be inimical to the interest of labor. Last fall we were hearing a good deal about right to work, putting labor under antitrust and so on, which I felt was would be a mistake. We were therefore considering what would be alternatives which would meet the particular abuses, but at the same time not prevent labor from organizing and bargaining collectively.
Senator, now that the wild and woolly Kohler hearings have come to an end, I wonder if you could evaluate for us what was accomplished, if anything, out of the hearings.
Well, in the first place, it always seemed to me that the place for the Kohler hearing was in the National Labor Relations Board. It was a bitter strike with very severe animosities on both sides, violence and improper practices on both sides. It was impossible for us to settle the strike. We haven't settled it. And it's a place where the National Labor Relations Board, they've been looking into it for some time. The trial examiner has made his findings, and I think that's the area where it should have been. But nevertheless, many of the members wanted to look into it, and we've looked into it. We've exposed the fact that there have been abuses on both sides. What I do think the benefit, the greatest benefit, is that we certainly brings out that the National Labor Relations Board is too slow in its consideration of these problems. This strike has been going on since 1953. The National Labor Relations Board hasn't rendered a final decision yet, so that I think that if there is a benefit to it, it's been that we've just certainly pointed out the necessity for speeding up the procedures of the NLRB so that
Senator, I wonder if I could get a direct answer to the question of whether or not you are interested in the presidency in 1960.
Well, I don't know whether you consider the answer direct, Mr. Lawrence, but I'm a candidate for the United States Senate, and I think that that is requiring all my attention, and it seems to me that I should take care of that matter before I'd even consider doing anything else.
Well, Senator, if it's requiring all your attention, with great respect, why are you making speeches this coming month in North Dakota and South Dakota and Ohio and Minnesota, in Eugene and Portland, Oregon?
I'm also making, I believe, 5 speeches during that period in Massachusetts.
Yes, I wondered.
That's 2 weekends, and I'm also speaking in every weekend in May in Massachusetts and in June, so that I think I'm prepared, Mr. McConaughey, to campaign, and I have been campaigning very actively in Massachusetts. I'm also interested in the Democratic Party nationally, and I'm delighted to go where I'm asked, where I'm able to go.
Senator, would it be fair to say that you have not taken yourself out of the race, that you have not removed yourself as a possibility as one of the top 2 spots in the Democratic National?
Well, I think that it would be a great mistake to do 2 things at once. I've made very clear that I am running now in Massachusetts, and while I would like to be of more assistance to you, I think I should certainly complete that task before I should decide what else I'm going to try to do.
Senator, before we leave this matter of the Kohler strike, Mr. Ruther indicated that he thought that at least 2 of the Republican senators had engaged in a smear campaign, that they were out to get him. What's your appraisal of that situation?
Well, I think that Mr. Ruther and the 3 Republican members exchanged strong statements during the last 3 days. I would not characterize and I have not either Mr. Ruther in the terms that they've used, nor would I criticize the members of the committee. I think both of those, Mr. Ruther and the 3 Republican members, are competent to protect their own interests, and I would not engage in personality discussions on either side.
Senator, do you feel that the President was correct the other day when he said that the recession seemed to have reached the bottom or very near the bottom, or what's your view of the economic situation?
Well, it may have, the question is, it may have reached the bottom, but how long will it be in this sort of plateau? And I think that figures this week indicate to me increase in labor surplus areas, the prediction by the railroads that car loadings will be down 10% in the second quarter and so on. It would indicate to me that the recession has not reached its lowest peak, and then it will be with us for a substantial period of time.
Well, now, you've been talked about, sir, whether you're willing to admit it or not, in terms of presidential timber 2 years hence. What would you do that the administration has not done to face this problem of the economic recession?
Well, in the first place, Mr. Lawrence, I would have, there are some things that were done that I would not have done. I think that the administration, while the Federal Reserve Board is an independent agency, the administration does have influence in it. The decision last August to tighten credits was a great mistake. The decision by the Defense Department to stretch out defense purchases at the very time when new plan investment was falling down, I think, contributed to this cycle. I think the recommendations of the administration on improving unemployment compensation are completely inadequate. I regret that greater emphasis has not been given, was not given last November when this matter became more obvious to intensifying federal spending on a whole variety of areas. And I think that the President's prediction about a month or a month and a half ago that the upturn would take place in March has been proved wrong. The upturn has not taken place, and I therefore feel that on a number of areas the administration is liable to criticism.
Well, in terms of the only race that you admit you're making, which is for senator, would you say that the recession will be a prime political issue in the year 1958?
Well, I would say yes, it will be, definitely, and the handling of it and the reaction to it, definitely.
In the general field of national politics, Senator, do you think that the candidate in the Democratic Party would have to be definitely associated with the liberal wing of the party in 1960?
I do.
You believe that you are in that wing?
I do.
You count yourself as a liberal?
I do.
Do you think that your position in regards to, and I quote now from Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt's recent magazine article, in which she said that you had, to summarize it, that you had dodged the McCarthy issue in 1954 and then in 1956. Do you think she's beating a dead horse, or is that still a live issue?
Well, in the first place, Mr. Madigan, as you know, I was not in the Senate for about a year. I was in the hospital a good deal of that time, at the time, unfortunately, that the censure motion came up. I stated on this program, I believe in an answer to a question of yours before the convention, that while I regretted having missed it, I considered the censure action a reasonable action and a proper one, and one that I approved of. I've said it on other television program, and I'm glad to say it again.
Why is Mrs. Roosevelt bringing this up again?
Well, Ms. Roosevelt was writing her memoirs of the 1956 convention in which she stated her opinion. I admire her and what she's done. I think that my position, I hope, is clearer to her. And in addition, on the basic question of civil liberties or due process, I've been in the Congress for 12 years, and I believe that my record stands up very well in comparison with that of any man or woman.
Senator, on the labor hearings again, I understand that the McClellan Committee has recommended in its report that labor leaders file personal income statements, financial statements. I was wondering, also one newspaper has suggested that congressmen do the same. I was wondering what your view of that was.
Well, no, that's inaccurate, Mr. Clark. The committee recommended that there be improved financial reports on unions. In addition, they also recommended that we do something about middlemen on employers. Now, the unions make a report now of their assets, and so that they made a generalized recommendation. My own particular proposal was that in cases of conflict of interest that they make a report, but I would be opposed to union leaders having to make a declaration of assets unless they held assets in the company, and I repeat, at the same time they're representing the employees in collective bargaining. Now, that's very seldom done, and only in cases where they have a substantial interest in that company. So that I think that's a very rare case, and in those cases we should have a disclosure, and that's all that's proposed, not a personal statement, and I'd be opposed to that, as I would be for any American.
Senator, I wonder if I could follow up part of the colloquy you had with Mr. Lawrence on the matter of this recession and the administration's failures. What is your position, sir, on the proposal for a tax cut?
Well, I would agree that with the more or less truce which has been declared until the March figures are in, my feeling will be that when the March figures are in the middle of April, that it will show that the recession is not coming to an end, and that therefore at that time, it's my opinion that a tax cut will be recommended. But I think it would be fair and in the best interest to hold judgment until the middle of April.
What, can you bound it? How large? Where would you have these cuts?
Well, I'd certainly have them in excise taxes.
And what about individual
And I would have them
incomes?
on personal income, certainly an increase in the personal exemptions.
Can you suggest a figure?
Well, if it went up to $700 from $600, would cost $2 billion. It's just a decision as to how much you want to put into the pot as far as ability to spend. Now, it is a fact that personal savings are up. We want to make sure that when we give this cut, we're not giving it because we feel we can afford it in relation to our national commitments, but only to stimulate the economy. And therefore, as you know, there are very serious disagreements as to what kind of cuts will best do that. I couldn't write a tax bill for you today, but I would say that it certainly would include the $600 to $700, if not more. It would include excise taxes, and it would include, I believe, some reduction on taxes on small business. Now,
What
It
would be
may
the
go
total
as
price
high.
tag?
What'd you say?
What would be the total price tag, a rough figure? Could you give
Well, I
us
don't
one?
know. I think that's why we want to wait till April, and I think get the best advice from the Treasury. I would think that any tax cut would certainly have to go over up to $5 billion if we're going to make any appreciable difference. In the final analysis, of course, based on our experience in the 30s, government spending does not, you can't spend yourself out of a recession, particularly as what we're talking about is $5 billion worth of spending in comparison to a gross national product of $350 billion. But it does have a supplementary effect. At the same time, we have to accelerate government spending. I would think the figure, if a tax cut come, would go over $5 billion. But that would bring a substantial deficit for the year, and I don't think we want to do that, and I think quite properly until the middle of April, until we can make a judgment as to whether this thing's going through the summer.
Senator, with this country already in debt to the tune of $275 billion, roughly, how can we ever expect to pay off this debt if we're now talking about more deficit financing?
Well, the question, it seems to me, Mr. Lawrence, is whether you keep an economy going and operating. What costs you the most in real terms? Having your steel industry cut 50% in production, and having people unemployed and not working, and having a general slowdown in our whole gross national product. That's debt by itself, as every American company is in debt. What you have to be able to do is to handle the debt and pay the interest on it and meet your bond. And I think that there's no reason why the United States can't do that. I have every confidence in its financial stability. But what we don't want to do, and it seems to me it's imperiled more, if you ever permit this economy to begin to unwind and you get widespread unemployment up to 8 or 9.
Well, Senator, I understand the theory of
I don't think
the
it's just a
tax
theory.
cut.
I think it's a fact.
Well, I understand the theory of what it does, but nevertheless, in periods of peak prosperity, before the recession, we cut taxes since this administration came to power instead of paying off the national debt. The debt remaining about where it is, or even going a bit higher.
Mr. Lawrence, you can't pay off the debt and be the greatest. That's not even conceivable, nor is it necessary. What you have to be able to do is pay the interest on the debt any more than the United States Steel is going to attempt to pay off its debt. That would be the most deflationary. It would cause widespread unemployment and would be a national disaster. You don't have to do it. All you have to do, it seems to me, is pay your interest to be able to pay your bonds. And as long as you have an expanding economy, you can do that very well.
And keep it about where it is now for the rest of our lives. The rest of our lives is a nation.
The fact is that your debt in comparison, your interest on your debt, which is the problem that you should face, is not as high in proportion to your gross national product as it was in the 30s. I have confidence in the viability of the American economy. What you want to be able to do is keep it moving ahead so you can put these people to work who are coming into the labor market every year. I don't propose that all Americans pay off all their companies pay off their debts. It's not necessary. What you want to be able to do is meet your payments.
Senator, when you cut taxes and when you accelerate government spending, as you've indicated you think might have to be done in April, isn't it necessarily a logical consequence that you're going to have to raise the national debt limit again?
Yes, I think that undoubtedly that's going to have to, that will be a partner of any tax reduction.
Do you see any danger in that?
Well, I don't think this is a happy situation. I see danger, however, in unemployment and a drop in the steel, and a cut in our steel production of 50%. That's and the automobile industry having more cars backed up than it's had since before the war. Those are danger signs too. So I think what you have to do is to decide what is a prudent policy to meet that. You just can't sustain and go down and down and down as we did in 29, 30, and 31. That was where the real cost is.
In terms of accelerated government spending, where do you think that spending ought to occur?
I think it ought to occur in schools and reclamation projects. We've done something about roads, hospitals, all of the sort of public services which are going to have to be worked on in order to deal with an expanding economy. School construction, assistance to universities in order to take care of a tremendously increasing population there. Those are things that need to be done. Reclamation projects in the West and so on.
I think it's a
Public
fact,
work.
isn't it, that there's a certain amount of lead time involved, that even if
There
you go
is,
into
and in
those
taxes,
programs...
and in taxes, too.
So
It's
that
hard
it
to
would
get
be,
it right
how
in
long,
there.
a year or 2 years before any real appreciable effect would be felt?
No, I would think late summer. The summer.
Late this summer.
But also, you know, a good deal of spending takes place in appreciation of better times. And therefore, if they feel that there's going to be a spurt in the fall, more will be done now about planned investment. But I agree the actual spending will not take place immediately.
Senator, do you have any estimate or range of estimates for what the deficit might be this year, the federal deficit?
No, I don't, because it would depend on the tax cut but
In this
will
fight
be.
against the recession, your proposals differ somewhat from the administration's in expanding and extending unemployment
That's
compensation.
correct.
Do
That's
yours
right.
have
They merely expand it. They do not increase the benefit, which is now lower in proportion to wages than it was in 1939.
which bill will win out?
I would think that probably the administration may have more troops, but I'm hopeful we're going to have a vote on the Senate floor on this matter, and I'm hopeful that at least we'll do something about raising benefits to 50% of the wages.
How soon do you expect it to come out?
It's hearings in the House now, I think in the, I'd say the 20th of April, around in there.
Senator, before we got away from that political discussion of whether you are or are not a candidate, I don't know whether you've noticed, but you've made yourself on an exact parallel, all fours, with Adlai Stevenson's position in 1952. His answer was then he could not run for the Democratic nomination for president because he was a candidate for governor. And later on he said that no man could be so big-headed that he could turn down such a job as the presidency. Can you be drafted?
Well, now, Mr. Madigan, I know that in the first place there's substantial differences. This is 1958. I'm trying to run for the Senate in Massachusetts. And I think that after that, it seems to me a better decision can be made and those questions can be asked and you could expect an answer. But I don't think, it seems to me right now that it's very clear what my responsibility is.
You
Well,
couldn't
would you
turn
make
down
the-
the nomination.
Yeah, go
You wouldn't turn down the nomination.
Well, now, if I'm offered it, Mr. Madigan, or if you're in a position to, I can give you an answer, but I'm not going to answer a question at a time when the matter is not before us and what would not be before us would be completely unlikely to the situation.
Well, sometimes there is a pitch made in this kind of political discussion that somebody who's running for governor guarantees that he'll serve his full term. Are you prepared to guarantee to the people of Massachusetts that if reelected in '58, you will serve your full term in the Senate?
Well, I would certainly hope that I would, unless something happens to me that's adverse to my health or the interest. I expect to serve my full term. That's what
You
I
would
expect to happen.
expect a six-year term.
That's what I expect
You have
to
no
happen.
other ambitions above the Senate.
Well, I certainly, at this time, Mr. Lawrence, it seems to me very clear where my ambitions lie.
Senator, I feel I have to ask you a question that I wish I didn't have to ask you at all. But the question is, I think, a political reality, and that's the matter of certain problems that arise from candidates who belong to the Catholic Church. Do you feel that this is now, in the United States, a problem?
Well, I'm a Catholic, as you know,
Yes.
Mr. Novins. I've been a candidate 4 times. I've never found that it's a problem at all.
I'm thinking now of national office, and without reference to any possible candidacy that you as an individual might be involved
Well, I don't think you'd ever really tell whether it'd be a problem until the candidate runs. And you could tell it was a matter at issue in 1928. Whether it would be again would depend on the circumstances at that time. And so I think the only way you can tell is to put it to the test. At that time, I can give you an answer.
Senator, if we could go to foreign affairs for a moment. You've been very critical of the Eisenhower administration for its drift policy in regard to the
That's correct.
hot war in Algeria. What would you have the administration do that it has not done with respect to the Algerian struggle?
Well, as you know, Mr. Lawrence, the effect of the United States policy, both in the UN and in the use of equipment in North Africa and Algeria, the sale of the helicopters and so on, that it's quite obvious that the United States has supported the French position, feeling we have a great dependence on France. It's a very difficult situation, and I know that Mr. Dulles could not speak or act quite as I can as a member of the Senate. But nevertheless, in my opinion, the French position there is costing the free world and France very heavily in men, in the NATO defenses, in money. The United States has recently been of some assistance to France, over $600 million. Most of the reason for that loan was the Algerian war. So the point is we're involved. I would try to make it clearer to the French in every way, diplomatically and in every other way, that we would hope that it would be possible for the French, as we did with the Philippines, to set some date, not immediately, 5 years, 10 years, at which time there would be solid guarantees that the Algerian people would be able to determine what sort of a relationship they wanted with France, if any. In that period of time, it seems to me many of the economic changes and everything could take place. Now, that's what I would hope could be done.
Well, in other words, the Algerian people, in your view, would have the right at some specified date to decide whether or not they were independent.
That's correct.
Or whether they wish to remain.
Seems to me that's the only hope. Otherwise, it's going to get worse and worse there. It's going to sour our relations with Tunisia and with Morocco. Any hope of a North African federation will be doomed. The effect it has on Africa and the Middle East. The United States is very vitally associated in the minds of those people with French policy in that area. We're the losers, and therefore to think that we're not participants in that struggle in every way is a mistake. I think we might as well recognize it and do the best we can to associate ourselves with what is obviously going to happen. Algeria sometime is going to be independent. I would hope that when they did, that they had some feeling that we had been of some shown some French
just how
support.
far would you have the United States go in putting pressure on France? Would you have it actually terminate military supplies?
No, I would not, Mr. McConaughey. I think it's a mistake. We're dependent on France. I think that would result in a rupture. What we hope is that through all of the means, we're not without influence in all these situations, I hope. And if we are influenced, I would like our influence used in the way I've suggested, but I would not attempt to put a gun to France's head, because it would be self-defeating, and the French reaction would be extremely adverse to our interests, the interests that I've just discussed, particularly when we need France for the missile bases, the cooperation on missile bases. I would attempt to use our influence, and I assume we have some.
Senator, we're expecting, that is, most people in Washington are expecting an announcement from the Russian government that they will unilaterally suspend nuclear tests, and there seems to be some question as to how we can handle this on a propaganda basis or on a diplomatic level. Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, if they make their suggestions that on a unilateral basis, I think we still have to insist on our terms for inspection in there before we arrest our own tests. For us to then arrest our own tests and dismantle our operation with them free on a unilateral basis to commence tests again anytime they wanted to, I think would be a mistake.
Well,
it seems to me we should stick to that point, continue our tests if we need to, unless the Russians still are willing to include inspectors within the country.
It seems to provide a propaganda victory for the Russians. Do you feel that our general propaganda campaign has been as good as it ought to be?
No, it hasn't. They have many advantages, of course, which we do not have, but I don't think it has been on disarmament. I think it might have been possible for us to have a stronger position on that and on a summit meeting, but I would not permit them to unilaterally dismantle our testing apparatus with a complete freedom for them to resume unless there are international guarantees.
Is there any way that we could heighten the effectiveness of our propaganda efforts to the uncommitted world?
Well, I've attempted to indicate one way.
Yes.
In the case of Algeria, and I think also in questions of assistance to India, stronger support for countries like Poland and so on. In all these ways, I think to associate ourselves with the aspirations of these people to get some sort of political independence and economic stability.
Well, Senator, thank you very much indeed for coming here to Face the Nation, and thanks also to today's panel of newsmen, to John Madigan of the Chicago American, Blair Clark of CBS News, James McConaughey of Time and Life, and William H. Lawrence of the New York Times. This is Stuart Novens. We invite you to join us next week when Dr. James Conant, the former president of Harvard University, now conducting a national education survey, will face the nation. Our program will be heard 1/2 hour earlier over most of these stations. Today's program originated in Washington.
Face the Nation was produced by Ted Ayers, associated in production Bill Coben, directed by Bill Linden. This has been a presentation of CBS News. Today you saw Senator John F. Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts, face the nation. Al Stepler speaking.